As the final months of World War II unfolded, Germany faced a desperate situation. Its armies were faltering on every front. And the Nazi regime, unwilling to concede defeat, began turning to increasingly extreme measures to fill its ranks. One of the most shocking of these was the conscription of children. Boys who, under normal circumstances, would have been in school or playing with friends, were instead being trained, armed, and sent to the front lines. Some were barely in their teens, 12, 13, or 14 years old. And yet they were thrust into a world dominated by death, fear, and unimaginable violence. These were not young men ready for war. They were children, braced to face an adult world that demanded they fight, often with the understanding that survival was far from guaranteed. The Nazi regime had formalized this with programs like the Volkssturm and the Hitler Youth, turning these children into the last line of defense against the advancing Allied forces. By 1944 and 1945, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, and Germany's leadership was willing to sacrifice even its youngest citizens to try to stem the tide. Boys were trained in rudimentary military skills, handed rifles that were often larger than they could comfortably hold, and marched to defend towns and villages from enemy soldiers. They were told of the patriotic duty they carried, conditioned to believe that surrender was dishonorable and that death in combat was the ultimate act of heroism. For these children, the war was not just an abstract concept taught in history lessons. It was a terrifying, immediate reality. The conditions under which these young soldiers lived were brutal. Food was scarce, equipment was minimal, and there was little time for proper training. In many cases, they were expected to face veteran soldiers with just a rifle and sheer courage. The psychological toll was enormous. These boys were simultaneously indoctrinated with propaganda glorifying sacrifice and confronted with the grim realities of war. Explosions, gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the omnipresence of death. Many were sent forward into battle with the knowledge that survival was unlikely, their youth making them particularly vulnerable to both physical danger and emotional trauma. They were braced for death in a way that no child should ever be, living under the constant shadow of mortality while still clinging to the faint hope of making it through another day. For the boys themselves, understanding the situation was complicated. Some clung to the ideology they were taught, believing that they were serving a noble purpose, that their sacrifices were for a greater good. Others were simply terrified, realizing that they were being used as cannon fodder in a war they did not choose. Letters, diaries, and later testimonies reveal the conflicting emotions these children experienced. Pride and fear, courage and despair, confusion and resignation. Many were forced to grow up overnight, their childhood stolen and replaced by a soldier's grim reality. The German leadership's approach reflected both desperation and cruelty. They were willing to exploit these children, sending them into hopeless situations because the alternative, allowing the Allies to advance unopposed, was unacceptable in the eyes of Hitler and his inner circle. In some cases, these boys were stationed in heavily fortified positions, told to hold ground at all costs, knowing full well that their chances of survival were slim. Families, too, were caught in this moral and emotional dilemma. Parents were pressured to allow their children to be conscripted, and those who resisted faced scrutiny or punishment. The war had infiltrated the most intimate parts of German life, leaving little space for innocence or protection. It is important to grasp the magnitude of this tragedy. These children were not mere extras in the theater of war. They were central actors in a deadly script imposed upon them. Unlike adult soldiers, who had a modicum of choice or understanding, these young boys were at the mercy of a regime that valued ideology and desperation over human life. They faced the unimaginable, armed and expected to fight in a collapsing army, bracing themselves daily for death, and experiencing trauma that would haunt them long after the war ended. Many would carry the scars of these experiences into adulthood, grappling with memories of fear, loss, and forced responsibility that no child should ever bear. Yet, amid this bleak reality, there is also the story of resilience. Even in the face of extreme danger and indoctrination, these children displayed moments of humanity and survival instinct. Some found fleeting bonds with fellow soldiers, clinging to camaraderie as a source of strength. Others discovered courage they did not know they possessed, simply in their efforts to stay alive and navigate a world turned upside down. Their experience was one of extreme loss and forced maturation. But it was also a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, even in the youngest among us. Understanding the plight of these German child soldiers is crucial for appreciating the broader Human cost of war. It highlights the lengths to which a desperate regime will go and the profound suffering inflicted upon those least able to resist. These were children braced for death, pushed into a fight they did not choose. Yet they were also witnesses to the extraordinary resilience of human life under unimaginable pressure. Their story sets the stage for the next chapter, where the unexpected compassion of their captors in Minnesota would transform fear into survival, and hostility into care, showing that even amidst the horrors of war, humanity could prevail. When these young German soldiers, many still children in every sense of the word, were captured by American forces and sent to internment camps in the United States, including places like Minnesota, the story took a remarkable turn. What could have been a continuation of fear, suffering, and mistrust instead became a narrative of unexpected humanity. For the first time, these boys, braced for death, conditioned to expect brutality from everyone around them, encountered Americans who treated them not as enemies or even as prisoners, but with a level of kindness that most could scarcely imagine. The contrast between the world they had been forced into and the one they found in Minnesota was stark. Here, there were no relentless drills, no constant threats of punishment, no ideological indoctrination demanding that they die for a cause. Instead, there were people willing to see them as what they truly were. Children who had been caught in the machinery of war. The Americans who interacted with these boys approached them with a combination of curiosity, empathy, and practical care. They fed them proper meals, ensured they had clean clothing, and offered medical attention when needed. For many of these children, it was the first time in months, or even years, that they had experienced consistent nourishment or basic safety. The smallest gestures, a warm bed, a hot meal, or a friendly conversation, carried profound weight. For boys who had been trained to anticipate violence at every turn, these acts of care were astonishing. It challenged their deeply ingrained expectations and forced them to reconsider everything they had been taught about the people they had been taught to fear. Beyond physical care, the emotional impact was equally significant. American soldiers, camp staff, and even local families often treated these German youths as if they were their own children, extending patience, understanding, and guidance in ways that were entirely unfamiliar to the boys. Letters and later testimonies describe moments where adults would listen to their fears, engage them in conversation, and, most strikingly, treat them with genuine respect and kindness. This treatment was not conditional or performative. It was a reflection of a humanistic approach that acknowledged the profound wrongness of sending children to fight in a war they could not understand. In essence, these boys were given the opportunity to reclaim some fragment of their stolen childhood, to breathe and exist in a space that was safe, nurturing, and, crucially, non-judgmental. Many of the boys formed bonds with Americans who went beyond the formal roles of guards or administrators. Some were invited into homes. Others were mentored in practical skills, and a number found themselves included in activities that resembled ordinary childhood experiences, playing sports, helping with chores, or simply sharing stories. These moments were transformative. They offered a stark contrast to the fear, discipline, and indoctrination they had endured in Germany. For the first time, they could imagine a world in which adults did not demand blind obedience, did not glorify death, and did not see them solely as instruments of war. Instead, they experienced care, patience, and even affection, leaving a lasting impression that many carried with them long after their release. The American approach was not only humane, it was strategic in its own subtle way. By treating the boys with dignity and compassion, the Americans were able to manage the camps more effectively, fostering trust and reducing resistance. These children, conditioned for fear and suspicion, began to respond in kind. They followed rules not out of terror, but out of a growing recognition that the people around them genuinely sought their well-being. The environment in Minnesota, therefore, became a rare space of stability and moral clarity amidst the chaos of war, allowing the boys to regain a sense of agency and identity beyond the labels imposed upon them as enemy combatants. Quote, "It is also worth noting the broader cultural implications of this treatment. In a war defined by stark divisions, cruelty, and ideological zeal, the Americans' decision to humanize the enemy's youngest soldiers was extraordinary. It reflected a moral courage that was not required by law or military protocol but arose from a deep recognition of shared humanity. The compassion extended to these children challenged prevailing notions of enemies as irredeemable, showing that even amidst conflict, there is space for empathy. For the boys themselves, this experience reshaped their understanding of humanity and survival. Many later recounted that the kindness they encountered in Minnesota prevented them from succumbing entirely to bitterness or hatred, offering a glimpse of hope after years of trauma and fear. This treatment also had a lasting impact on post-war reconciliation. Some of the boys who had been held in the United States eventually returned to Germany or emigrated elsewhere, carrying with them memories of the care and respect they had received. These experiences challenged narratives of the enemy as wholly monstrous and illustrated the potential for human connection even across the most extreme divides. The story of American compassion in Minnesota reminds us that while war can destroy innocence, it cannot completely erase the capacity for empathy and moral action. Ultimately, the story of these German child soldiers is not only one of loss and trauma, it is also one of extraordinary human kindness. Braced for death and conditioned to fear the world, these children were met with care, patience, and a recognition of their humanity that transformed their experience. In Minnesota, they discovered that even in the midst of war, people could act with compassion, seeing not an enemy, but a child in need of safety and care. This chapter in history underscores a profound truth. While war seeks to divide and destroy, acts of human kindness can bridge even the widest chasms, offering hope and healing in its wake.